So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Donna Auston is an anthropologist, a writer, an activist whose body of work focuses on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, media representation, and Islam in America. Her dissertation is at ethnographic exploration of Black Muslim activism and spiritual protest in the Black Lives Matter era. Some of her written works includes book chapters on the historical contributions of African American Muslims in the arts, cultures, and social justice movements, and the intersection between Islamophobia and Black Lives Matter. Donna has a forthcoming co-authored book chapter on Black Islam and U.S. politics. She has also published a number of short essays, including Mapping the Intersections of Islamophobia and Black Lives Matter, Unearthing Black Muslim Life and Activism in the Policing Crisis, and Recalled to Life on the Meaning and Power of a Die-In. Her work has been covered by national news outlets, including NBC News and the Huffington Post, and she was named one of the top 100 Muslim social justice leaders by MPower Change in 2016. So with heart and soul, Donna, we welcome you today.
So I was asked to offer some reflections about the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. And so what I want to do today is actually, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. I want to take you through some current events from the last week. Connected to my personal spiritual journey, and from there to talk about how that connects to the life of the beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so, as you all, I'm sure, are aware by now, this past week, we witnessed, even if from afar, an extremely traumatic and devastating tragedy in New Zealand. If last Friday, not just this past Friday, but the Friday previous, a white supremacist ideologue went into 2 New Zealand mosques and went on shooting rampage in both of those places. To date, if I am not mistaken, the death toll is at 51, and many more were injured, and many more than that, even if they were not directly hit with bullets, were traumatized in ways that are, in fact, unimaginable. And so it's been a rough week, and so I think part of what I'm trying to do here is to help us to think about what would the Prophet Muhammad have us do in moments like these. So that's the first incident that I want us to begin thinking about. The second incident also took place this week, which is probably less familiar to some of the people in the listening audience. It took place in my hometown. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And what happened there, just for a show of hands, is anyone familiar with the name Antoine Rose? Raise your hand. So there's a couple of hands in this room. So Antoine Rose was a 17-year-old African-American teenager who, in June of 2018, was shot in the back as he ran away by a white police officer in East Pittsburgh, which is a suburb. It's outside of it's outside of the city of Pittsburgh. But the trial of the officer for shooting this, and it was captured on video. It happened in broad daylight. He was clearly running away, and he was shot fatally in the back as he ran, unarmed. And this week, just a few days ago, Antoine, the officer who was involved in that shooting, the officer who pulled the trigger, was acquitted by a jury that convened in Pittsburgh to decide whether or not this person should be held responsible for shooting an unarmed Black teenager in the back as he ran away. The verdict came back on Friday, so a week to the day from the New Zealand shooting. The verdict came back on this past Friday that the officer was acquitted of all charges. So no consequences for snuffing out the life of an unarmed Black teenager. I, as an African American Muslim, it's been a rough week. And there are a lot of things that could be said about these two incidents, but the connective thread that I want to draw your attention to today is the fact that both of these occurrences, both of these tragedies are held together by the fact that they are generated by the extremely dangerous ideology of white supremacy. One that we might think about as being something that manifests on an individual level, right? This individual shooter who espoused these particular ideals, used that as a motivation for his murderous rampage. The second incident is white supremacy as well, because Antoine Rose is not an isolated incident. Antoine Rose is a part of an epidemic that stretches back in this country to the very origins of organized policing itself. Organized policing in the United States began as vigilante slave patrols. And for those of you who may not be familiar with your U.S. history, slave patrols were vigilante crews of whites dispatched to recapture fugitive slaves. And this is how organized police get started in the U.S. So from the very beginning of law enforcement as we know it in the United States, it is directly connected to violence against Black bodies. Why do I bring this up? It has for me, and this will take me into the personal reflection portion of my remarks to you today. I became a Muslim. I wasn't born into a Muslim family. I became a Muslim at the age of 17. I was the same age as Antoine Rose. And a lot of why I was drawn to Islam in the first place, I discovered Islam in what might be perhaps, I don't know. I mean, it's actually fairly common, but maybe people don't think that folks discover Islam this way. I discovered Islam in large part due to the music I was listening to. I was an avid consumer of hip hop. I grew up on hip hop. And in 1987, 1988, a kind of subgenre of hip hop music known as conscious rap, right, was at its heyday. And many of those artists were either Muslims or had Muslim sympathies, in part because of a long tradition of Black Islam, particularly in the United States, is being a movement that stood for social justice in those communities. And so even if people were not Muslim, they knew the Muslims to stand for racial justice particularly, and against white supremacy. And so this was reflected in a lot of the lyrics that I was consuming at the time. And for me, I heard Malcolm X's voice for the first time over a hip hop beat. And Malcolm X articulated a spiritual framing of the fight against white supremacy as a moral imperative. And my discovery of Malcolm X led me to the discovery of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And so it was there that I discovered that the prophetic imperative, if you will, the moral imperative of the beloved of Allah was mercy, was to care for the vulnerable, was to make that a part of his religious practice. So you pray, you fast, you give zakat, you make hajj, you do all of these things, but a part of your worship is to make sure that the vulnerable, the people who don't have enough food to eat, the people who don't have safety and security, people who are subject to being shot in the street because of their identity, you make sure that a part of what you do as a pious human being on earth is that you actually move in whatever way you have and whatever means you have at your disposal to make sure that people don't live in these vulnerable states, that we do what we can to eradicate danger and insecurity and poverty and lack in people's lives. And that is a moral command. And so for me, my reflections on what the Prophet Muhammad would have us do when the New Zealand shooting happens, and for the reasons that it happens, and when the countless cases, and they really are countless, cases of people who are subject to police violence because of their racial identity are killed every day in this country, right? That we as Muslims, as people who understand that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, left us marching orders, that he left us instructions about what we are supposed to be doing. What he told us was that we ought not to be passive when things like this are happening around us. That means with whatever we have, our money, our wealth, our persons, our intellect, our talents, our voices, we need to be used in the service of establishing justice in the earth. And so this is the prophetic inheritance, right? And that means that each and every one of us ought to be reflecting on exactly how and where we enter the fight. It's everybody's fight. It's not just the responsibility of, for example, people of color or people who are targeted by white supremacy to eradicate it. It's everybody's responsibility. Even those who, maybe because of their racial identity, maybe they don't see themselves as active racists, right? But they too, you too, if that's you, have a responsibility to not just, kind of passively engage with these ideas and oppose these ideas, but actually actively do something. Use your social positioning in a way that protects those who are more vulnerable. Angela Davis, who is a very prominent and long-time African-American freedom fighter and intellectual, she's a professor of philosophy. One of the things that she said is that in a racist society, it is not enough to be not racist. You have to be anti-racist, which is a difference between a passive state and an active one. And so I became a Muslim in part because I was attracted to the idea of anti-racism as a spiritual practice. And this was connected to the prophetic message. And to that end, and this is where I'll kind of wrap up my remarks here today, there are two particular examples that I want to highlight. There's so many examples from the life of the prophet, peace be upon him, that demonstrate his commitment, to kind of lowering his wing in mercy towards creation. There's tons of, right, and we know most of these stories, right? Everything from, when somebody would come to him for a religious ruling, and they had a immediate pressing, like physical, like dunya need, right? He didn't tell them to kind of, forget their dunya. He would try to, like if they were hungry, he'd try to make sure they had, okay, let me give you something so that then you can hear the spiritual lesson. Let's address the source of your agitation, right? Before I start telling you how to be holy, right? Because he understood that people have a really hard. Most of us, we're human. We have a very hard time focusing on like kind of the abstract when immediately we're experiencing some sort of duress or pressure or anxiety or scarcity. And so alleviating that was a part of his character, a part of his practice of mercy. Like mercy is a practice. It's not just an abstract concept. It's a practice. So it's a set of things that we do in order for it to be real. So that's just one example, right? But there's so many. So we know there's so many different examples. There are two in particular that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is his endorsement of something that was referred to as hilf al-fudul, right? In Qurayshi society, prior to his call to prophethood, so before he received the initial revelation, there existed something called hilf al-fudul, which was an alliance of individuals within Meccan society who came together on the basis of protecting the vulnerable people who existed in their midst. So Meccan society, pre-Islam, particularly, was the social structure was tied to like a clan structure, a clan affiliation. So if your clan was strong, then you generally, like you were good, right? You had protection. People were not gonna come at you. They're not gonna, or at least they're gonna think twice about doing it because they know that you have the backing of people who are gonna to excuse my lapse into the vernacular, they're gonna throw down for you, right? This is how the society was structured. Now, there are people who existed within Meccan society who did not have that type of social protection, right? They were the Antoine Roses of Mecca, right? And so this alliance of people, they came together, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a signatory to this pact. They decided that whenever someone who fit into that category, someone who did not have the backing of individuals to, kind of stand for them when they were being exploited and violated, that these people would themselves function as that person's clan. We will have your back so that you are not exposed to violence and violation, because that's unacceptable. So this was before he received the first revelations of Quran. So it existed, it came and went. Some years after he had received the revelation, he was talking about this with his companions, and he said, he described what the Hilf al-Fudul was, and he said, if I was summoned to that alliance right now, I will respond to the call. So he endorses this. Like, this is a practice that we as Muslims ought to be kind of reviving in whatever way that makes sense, right? You know, like, and I'm speaking, you know, kind of, you figure out what the hilful fudul in your circumstances looks like or should look like to be most effective. But the principle is what I'm getting at here, right? Is that he was telling us, he was commanding us that looking after those who are exposed to oppression is a duty that we have to respond to. And that requires an active configuration. That requires us to do something. That requires us to not just sit back and say, well, you know what, that's kind of terrible. And then kind of, you know, going on about our daily business because it doesn't impact us personally. So maybe I am a person that has a certain type of social privilege. So I mean, maybe I'm in some ways, you know, I feel some kind of way, right, about when I hear that somebody is attacked because of their identity. Thank you very much. Or whatever, or is exposed to violence because of who they are or because of whatever their social positioning is. But there's not anything that I need to do about that. Wrong. Right? We're obligated. So if you have some sort of you have resources with which that you can use to kind of offer some means of protection or alleviation for people who are vulnerable. That is an obligation. That's a part of his legacy that we can't ignore. It's a command. So that's the one thing that I want to highlight from his life. The second thing, and this is what I want to leave you with, particularly as it relates to the events that I started with, because again, as I see these events as connected, I see them as connected because of the way that white supremacy is the engine that animates both of these events, one on a somewhat individual level, right, as an individual actor, and the other on a structural level, right, because racism and white supremacy and Islamophobia and anti-Black racism and all of these other things and anti-immigrant sentiment, these things are individual actions, so sometimes it's like, you know, like a person, like between the two of us, we have this interaction where an individual person is demeaned or whatever, and so it's interpersonal, but it's also structural, and that's key, right? Because this is part of, that's where it really does the most damage, right? So anyhow, the last thing that I want to highlight is, in fact, the Prophet Muhammad's farewell sermon, peace and blessings be upon him. And this is one of the last direct messages that he left us with. As you know, of course, this is on the occasion of the final Hajj that he made on the day of Arafat, and he delivered this sermon. I won't read the translation. Most of you are familiar with the contents. It's short, right? But it contains a lot. And I want to draw your attention to two things in particular because they are particularly relevant as contentious issues in our time. One is the idea that one set of human beings might be, for whatever reason, superior over another by virtue of their lineage. And he addressed this. And what's interesting to me, there's a lot of things that are interesting to me about the farewell sermon, but you know, when somebody knows that they don't have a lot of time, right, they're going to cut to the chase. They're going to cut to the things that are the most important. These are the most important things for you to do. So I'm going to be leaving you soon. Here's what you really need to be paying attention to. And one of those things was racism. As something that is, like, it was so important that he addressed this on his final day, his final trip to Arafat. This is what I want to leave you with, right? White is not superior to a Black. Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, right? This was part of his parting message to us. And so, contrary to what I've heard a lot of, particularly coming from some of our religious leaders, interestingly, is that like anti-racist work is a spiritual practice. It's not, it doesn't belong to the secular, right? And it is a spiritual practice, right? Again, and my reasoning for that is the context in which this is delivered. This is one of the most auspicious days of the year, the day of Arafah. More so because it was the last time that he would address us as an ummah in perpetuity from that particular place. So he mentions anti-racism, right, as one of his pieces of parting advice. The second thing, again, because it is connected to a whole lot of the political and social engagement that we are seeing and hearing in our contemporary political climate, is that he mentions gender justice, right? And this is also something that he leaves us with, right? He leaves us with the command, for men to be kind to their wives, to be kind to their wives, to their women, to take care of the women, right? And this is not just within the context of the marital relationship, right? This is a broad command, right? That understanding that generally speaking, because of the way societies tend to be organized, and this is something that is remarkably consistent across time and history, is that men are very often in positions of power relative to the women, and therefore in a position to do damage, commit oppression and abuse much more frequently. And so he wanted to draw our attention as an essential spiritual imperative to make sure that we are making gender justice a part of our spiritual program within our homes, within our communities. And so I want to leave you there, right? There's no forum, right, that would ever do justice to the incredible legacy that the beloved of Allah has left us, right? We could be talking about, the wisdom in, one incident of his life for days, right? But those are some of the things that have been on my mind and in my heart this week, given the events that I described at the opening of this talk. As Muslims, I urge us to begin to move away from, and I see this a lot in public talks that I do, particularly with Muslim audiences, around the type of work that I do in terms of my research. My research, as the rabbi mentioned in the introduction, is connected directly with racial justice organizing among Black Muslims, right, in the era of Black Lives Matter, post-Ferguson, right? And when I talk about the epidemic of police brutality, racialized police brutality, and the amount of people who lose their lives, or if they even, it's actually broader, because many times people are involved in non-fatal encounters with the police that are violent and traumatic, but they don't die. So it's killings and brutality. There's a spectrum, right? And so I remember, for example, I was at one event a couple of years ago, and this was an audience that was largely unfamiliar with the issues. I mean, maybe they had heard some things, but it was, for many people, their first introduction into the scope of the problem. And we went through there was a panel, which I was a part of. We showed a short film at the beginning that really introduced, what Black Lives Matter was and what it was all about and why people were so agitated about this issue, and statistics and narratives. Each of the panelists, we were all African-American panelists, Muslims, and we each had, because most African-Americans have a personal narrative about police brutality. I have many, right? So we shared some of our personal experiences with this, in addition to whatever, quote unquote, expertise that we had to share. And one of the first questions from the audience when we opened the floor up for questions was, well, some of the activists associated with this movement are queer, right? So how can Muslims be involved with this? And I was actually really almost offended by the question, because we're talking, people are dying, and that's kind of the first thing that you go to. And so what it says to me, in many cases, we skipped over the fact that people are being killed to thinking about morality in a way that is constricted to a certain narrow set of issues, kind of like personal sexual behavior is where a lot of times discussions of morality in our community land, as if that's everything. Morality also includes justice work. Morality also includes, and this is a part of the prophetic legacy, making sure that your neighbor, this is a directive from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that, his wife Aisha said that he commanded us so much about the rights of the neighbor that we thought that he would make the neighbor an inheritor. He said that no person is a believer until if she goes to bed satiated and her neighbor is hungry, right? This is a command. So also, we are not moral human beings. We are not enacting morality. We are not living up to the prophetic legacy in total if our vision of morality does not include keeping people safe from harm, safe from violence, safe from deprivation, safe from harassment, safe from the hands of other human beings, right? So with that, I want to close, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. But I am challenging us. I want to leave us with a challenge, right? To think about, and not abstractly, tangibly, how am I responding through the prophet's legacy to the injustices that are happening around me every day? And make a pledge to yourself. We don't need to share it, right? But to yourself, what am I doing? And be honest about that. And what can I do? And I mean tangible action items. And they don't have to be big action items. They don't have to be Rome wasn't built in a day. Find something small that you can actually execute. That takes from the principles of the prophetic practice in this regard and implement in your life. Whatever that is. If you have some extra money, support people who are involved in racial justice work. If you have a platform via your job or your profession, or by virtue of connections you might have, I don't know, maybe somebody in this room is like a neighbor to Senator so-and-so, and they come over for dinner sometime. I don't know, it's possible, right? They gotta live somewhere. So whatever it is that you have, whether that is by speaking up and not being silent when you hear people demeaning other people on the basis of their social identity, whether that's race or whatever, or gender or whatever have you. How many times have we been in spaces where we've heard something that was dehumanizing to another human being or another group of human beings, and we didn't say anything because maybe those remarks were made in our masjid? And if that's happened, so what do I do about that? right? So confronting injustice wherever it is, right? Speak the truth, even if it is against your own selves, right? So take yourselves, do some inventory with yourselves. That's my parting challenge. How am I living up to the prophetic imperative or command to establish justice in my vicinity? So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for listening. Assalamu alaikum.